I'm Patrick Henningsen. I'm a journalist, independent analyst. I'm also the founder and editor of the news and analysis website, 21st Century Wire. I do broadcasting, radio, television, and I've been kind of active in this space for about almost 15 years. And we're here at the Tolfa International Forum this week, and it's a great opportunity to bring a lot of different people together. A lot of people from Scandinavia are here, which actually is fantastic because this is an important geopolitical pivot point now for the European Union, for NATO. So being here has given us a great opportunity to have conversations with people on and off stage amongst each other, and to flesh out what are the subjects that people are unpacking here. Things like war, politics, the economy. We're even talking about re-examining the COVID crisis as well. The influence that the United States, increasing influence the United States is having over the European political scene, but also foreign policy, economics, and debating really what direction Europe's going in. Is it going in the right direction? Are we going in a retrograde cycle? And what direction the world's going in? There's a lot of incredible things that are happening. I think there's a consensus here that we're in a state of flux. We're in a kind of in-between phase, between world orders. A lot like the interwar period, that's how I might liken it to, between the First World War and the Second World War. Big transitions, international institutions, and etc. So these are the issues that are emerging over this week. And what I've been talking about, and the other speakers as well, definitely the Ukraine issue, Russia, Ukraine, NATO. This is definitely elevated in the first few days of this forum as a major priority for debate, discussion, conversations. What's actually happened? What's really happened, as opposed to what the mainstream narrative says has happened, and what is the context of this currently, politically, and in history, and where is this heading? Are we headed for a frozen conflict? Are we headed for a nuclear standoff? These are the sort of really big and deep questions that have been posed here. We've had an opportunity to have even some very productive breakout sessions and conversations where we were looking at the map of the Arctic in Scandinavia and looking at U.S. military expansion in Norway, Sweden, and Finland. And it does look like this is where the focus is for the United States and NATO. It's moving to the north of Europe, and the Arctic is becoming a battleground for energy, for transit, for control, for surveillance, for a lot of things, for potential conflict between the West and Russia. That looks like this is what's being constructed here. So these are not like lightweight issues here. These are big, important, heavy, and a little bit worrying and disturbing issues as well. And I deal with this a lot as a journalist on a daily basis, and have done for many years. But there is something unique and I think special and very useful about bringing maybe a group of 20 or 30 people together and having good facilitators, experienced facilitators, guiding the conversation. And we were able to download a lot of facts and analysis. There's experts that focus in different areas. So this is a very great opportunity for me, and of course anyone attending, a great opportunity to have. So regarding U.S. military expansion in Scandinavia, we're talking about Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. I was aware of this issue, especially with regards to the fact that when the U.S. set up bases in these countries, that's a U.S. sovereign territory, and they have their own courts, they have their own laws, and a level of impunity for U.S. military personnel, and this has created problems all around the world. But that's not the most shocking part about it. And what we've learned this week is the scale of it. The scale of it, 47 bases throughout Scandinavia. And this is incredible. I don't think we've seen this level of concentration militarily anywhere else in the world outside of the United States. This even trumps the footprint in the Middle East. So what does that tell us? That tells us that there is something happening. Energy, money, focus, countries like the United States and Britain and leaders of NATO are really throwing their weight around in Northern Europe. So this is not trivial. This is not something that is a hedging measure by NATO or the United States. No, this is a priority. There are plans afoot to not just confront Russia, but also encircle Russia. And we're looking at a new Iron Curtain is fallen on Europe. And sadly, I think Western Europe is on the wrong side of this Iron Curtain at this point in history. So we're trying to understand this a little bit better here, and it does have a great impact, and more so going forward on European life, on European politics, certainly on budgets, on the economy. And we have to understand these things better. We have to understand all the different components and how all these issues fit together, how they're informing policy, how that policy is turning into legislation, how that's affecting people in their daily lives, in not just Scandinavian countries, but also in Europe, in Italy, where we're at. Italy is also a big military foothold for the United States. In NATO, so it's only fitting that we're having this conversation here as well, but is absolutely a brilliant setting for meeting like-minded people talking about serious issues over a week. So one of the big questions that's coming up and what people are asking is, how is this conflict between this proxy war between NATO and Russia, which is happening in Ukraine, how is this going to end? Can anyone declare a winner or a loser when we're at a sort of diplomatic stalemate? The two main parties and powers are not talking to each other. And how are you going to judge what is success? The West has to sell a story to their electorate. The Ukrainians have to sell a story to their people, and Russia has to sell a story to its people as well. But if you think about it, if the war ended today, and I preface this by saying America is very good. There's a lot of talk about America winning the wars. They're not that great at winning wars and haven't been, because they don't have the clear objectives normally when they get into it. So it ends up being a protracted conflict. But America is very good at losing. America is very good at losing, and what I mean by that is that the United States is very adept at pulling out of a situation and then selling it as a victory. And I think if the Ukraine conflict ended today, as it stands today, look at what's happened over the last 2 years. For NATO, it's been an absolute boon. NATO is being called irrelevant, brain dead before 2022. Now NATO is the driving force for European politics, military affairs, and economics. NATO determines where Europe can buy energy from. Where's Europe going to buy its weapons from? This is all determined now by NATO. That's the driving force. So what has NATO achieved? It's militarized Europe. Finland, Sweden have joined NATO. Now you have a militarization line from Scandinavia down to Poland, down right through to Ukraine, and Romania becoming hyper-militarized as a result of this conflict. So the old Iron Curtain has moved even further east, and again, the West is on the wrong side of that Iron Curtain today. But as Julian Assange said, the purpose of the war is to keep the system going. It's the military-industrial complex needs to constantly be reproducing itself. So if you agree with Julian Assange's thesis on that issue, then this can be declared a victory even if Ukraine is to cede territory that it has lost to Russia, the four oblasts, and perhaps even, well, obviously Crimea, but Odessa, if that happens to change hands in the future, that can still be declared a victory for the West, because the winner, whoever owns the casino, wins no matter who sits at the table and whatever the result of the card game is. And right now, the winner is the military-industrial complex. Ukraine would be the loser. Russia might be seen as a winner, but undoubtedly NATO is a winner. And military-industrial complex, the financial system, whoever profits and benefits from this tension, these wars, they've won. So a lot of people will be asking the question, because a few years ago, Donald Trump was making noises about NATO being somewhat irrelevant. Emmanuel Macron was saying it was a brain-dead organization. So NATO was in crisis, and Donald Trump arrives in Brussels throwing his weight around, saying, look at this, Europeans are ridiculous, you need to pay your fair share. The United States is no longer footing the bill for your defense. Of course, that was the post-World War II agreement, was that America would provide defense for Europe, and in response, Germany could build up its economy after being devastated from World War I, World War II, and the other European countries also can have access to the U.S. market in the post-World War II baby boom, the 1950s and 60s, and it's a win-win. Same for Japan. U.S. will take care of Japan's defense and occupy it militarily like they do Germany, and Japanese companies will enter the U.S. market and sell lots of cars and washing machines and electronics. And that's what happened, and it was hugely beneficial for the economies and the manufacturing sectors of those countries. So that's where NATO was born, out of that post-World War II order. And NATO is more than just a military alliance. They like to call it just a defense alliance. The NATO Secretary General Jan Stoltenberg, we are just a defensive alliance, nothing more. No, they're much more than that. And I always quote the first Secretary General of NATO. He was British, and his name was Lord Hastings Ismay. And he said in early 1950s, when NATO was founded, he said, the purpose of NATO is to keep the Germans down, the Russians out, and the Americans in. He means Europe. So that's all you need to know about NATO. And I say to everybody, what has changed, really, in 75 years? What actually has changed? And I'm going to say very little, because Europe is now where it was 70 years ago. The same type of situation. The United States playing the savior of Europe, and going to rebuild Europe, going to defend Europe. So it's a very important. NATO is the glove in which the United States can insert its hand to steer European political, economic, and foreign policy. It's as simple as that. So the United States will never relinquish that role in NATO. They can threaten to do it, but if they do, they will be withdrawing from Europe, and their influence over geopolitics, i.e., whether Russia and Germany can have a productive alliance, whether Europe and Asia can join together, the United States will be out of that picture if they withdraw from NATO. So I think the expansion of the United States in Scandinavia and the Arctic, as an example, is a sign that they are doubling down on their NATO commitments. They're doubling down on their position. And they're not NATO bases in Scandinavia, but they're U.S. bases. But this is the whole beauty of NATO, is the U.S. can use NATO as cover to go in multilaterally without having to pass a resolution of war with Congress, for instance. They can just do it by fiat through NATO. So NATO has always been used like this. Look at the bombing of Libya, look at Yugoslavia and so forth. They've been able to absolve themselves of basically going derelict of their constitutional obligations in the United States by working through, let's say, a vehicle like NATO. I think clearly what's happened is when NATO was founded, it was much smaller in terms of the number of members. It could at least portray itself as a defensive alliance, and a lot of people would agree with that over those decades, even though it might not be 100% true. But what's happened, especially since the fall of the Iron Curtain, or the old Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union, dissolution of the USSR, NATO should at that point have been disbanded, because the North Atlantic Treaty, its whole raison d'etre, was to defend Europe from a Soviet invasion and mutually assured destruction. We had nuclear weapons pointed at each other, and so one would think that with the USSR and that ideological threat of the spread of communism and all this stuff, once that was, you know, no longer a threat, NATO should logically be disbanded, and maybe a new treaty would be signed between the East and the West, but that didn't happen. Instead, what happened was NATO went into hyperdrive after the fall of the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union. NATO went into hyperdrive and went to an expansionist phase, 3 expansionist phases, and added the Baltic states on, a number of other Eastern European states, and now we are in 2024, and in the last few years, NATO has attempted now to add Ukraine to its portfolio of countries. And so clearly what you see is an encircling of Russia. There's no debate about that. And that will be the central issue for Russian national security concerns, is Ukraine becoming a NATO member and having nuclear-capable missiles parked within 7 to 10 minutes flight time of Moscow, right next door in Ukraine. That certainly was unacceptable for a country like Russia, who's a global nuclear superpower and a member of the UN Security Council. It's as unacceptable as it would be for the United States to have a similar scenario in Cuba, for instance. That actually happened in the 60s, and it caused a crisis that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, and the United States is seen as historically in the right for rejecting that, for even justified, the Kennedy administration at the time justified in taking the U.S. and the world to the brink of nuclear Armageddon in order to enforce what's called the Monroe Doctrine, which is the United States doctrine that they and only they can control the Western Hemisphere, and that there will be no offensive missiles or weapons placed in their hemisphere, and they will enforce that in any way they deem necessary. Why does that not apply to Russia in this case? And so this is the questions that the Russians are asking, and the countries allied with Russia. Why is it good for the United States, but not good for Russia? So NATO becoming an offensive alliance is the big change. It's come out of the closet as an offensive alliance. So this has created all sorts of problems for, I think, the balance of power and the prospects for peace, because it's an offensive alliance and because it has been weaponized in ways that many couldn't even have imagined back when it was created in the 50s and 60s, to the point where it's determining where Germany, effectively determining where Germany can buy its oil and gas from, and who it's going to be supplied from. And in this case, it's the United States now, after the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines. So it raises a lot of interesting and deeply concerning points around this issue. We're hoping to try to understand these a little bit better here at this forum, and maybe come away from these meetings with maybe some answers, or at least, at the very least, much more insight to how we got here and where we might be heading. So one of the results of this hyper-militarization that we see in this flashpoint between the West and Russia and Ukraine, but also in the situation in the Middle East with Palestine and Israel and Iran, is what we don't see in both cases is diplomacy. So clearly there has been, we're in an era that we could call the death of diplomacy. Now, it's not from a lack of trying from one of the sides in both of these situations, but the United States has taken a clear position that they will not talk to the Russian counterparts. They're saying, no, this has to be won on the battlefield, and Ukraine needs to get a stronger position for leverage for future negotiations. Well, while all this is happening, young men are dying in the hundreds of thousands. Ukraine is becoming smaller and smaller as a country, and both the East and the West are driving closer and closer to the brink of a potential nuclear standoff. Nobody in their right mind should want that. And we constructed all kinds of institutions after the Second World War to avoid this type of situation, to head off the disaster ahead of time. So it didn't get to such a critical phase where events could spiral out of control. Reactions, counter-reactions might cascade past the point of no return. One mistake could result in an exchange that could bring us past that point to a point where we might have a nuclear standoff. We had treaties in place. We had nuclear missile reciprocal agreements. All of these treaties, the INF, the ABM treaty, the Open Skies treaty, all of these things were agreed upon during the Cold War by a previous generation of skilled statesmen and diplomats. Well, they're no longer around. And there doesn't seem to be anyone who has replaced them in the West. Instead, we have people who are more hawkish than ever, with bated breath, hoping for an escalation in war, it seems, and they are escalating, arming Ukraine to attack Russian civilians and military targets, and even nuclear early warning radar stations inside Russia. Now, that would be unthinkable during the Cold War, because we had all of these checks and balances and people in place that seemed to be fair arbiters of the situation and skilled and smart enough to know what to avoid. And we don't seem to have that anymore. Likewise, in the Middle East, whenever there's talk of a ceasefire, the United States is nowhere to be found in terms of bringing all parties to the table. So their ally Israel, again, making hawkish threats towards Iran, U.S. politicians making threats to bomb Iran, to hit their nuclear facilities. This is now normal parlance, normal conversation today. It's been normalized. So we have two potential nuclear theaters for a nuclear standoff or serious escalation that could spiral into a much broader regional, maybe global conflict. We have no diplomacy going on in both cases. And as what Joe Biden calls, we are the indispensable nation. That's what he said about America. We're the indispensable nation. Well, if America is the indispensable nation, surely the indispensable nation should be leading the diplomatic process. But they're not. They're not doing that. They have basically withdrawn from that, and so it seems like the only other option is war. A lot of people we've been talking a lot about the U.S. election, and all U.S. presidential elections are watched and followed very closely by everybody in the world, because to some degree what the result is in the United States does have some effect and reverberates globally to a degree. But to what degree? This is an important question. So we're trying to unravel that question at the forum this week. And my explanation to this, and the way I look at it, is there's two elections in the United States. And this is for any election. There's two elections. There's the domestic election. This is me as a voter going in to vote. I have two things I'm thinking about: domestic issues and foreign policy. Now, on the domestic front, there is a big difference between Donald Trump and Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton. There's a big difference in terms of social agenda, the climate agenda, the economic policy. There are some stark differences there. Censorship is another thing. So there's some big differences there. So there's a big choice maybe that voters are going to have to make in terms of what policy they'll be pursuing. But when you look at foreign policy, between Democrats and Republicans consistently over decades is very little change from administrations. There is a real continuity of policy and continuity of government as the United States projects itself internationally. Very little difference. The difference is a nuance. The difference might be in the style, in how it sells the policy, or whether it's covert or overt. The Clinton administration, more covert operations. The Bush administration, the neocons, more overt, more bombastic. But the result is the same. They're both invoking the responsibility to protect, talking about human rights and spreading democracy. And they want to spread democracy because, as Condoleezza Rice, former Bush administration leading cabinet member, said, we have to export democracy because it's true. Democracy, peace theory. A lot of U.S. pundits will say that no two democracies have ever gone to war with each other. This is a trope that you hear constantly from people in the think tank world and policy people in the United States. Is, of course, what she's neglecting to tell you there is that the United States has overthrown more democracies in the last 80 years than every other country combined by far, and have assassinated more democratic leaders and deposed more democratic leaders than anybody else could possibly do, maybe in history. So that part is always left out of democracy peace theory. So by exporting democracy, the United States has consistently been undermining peace in the world. I think that goes without saying. It's beyond debate at this point. But so both parties in America more or less will pursue the same objectives and aims over time. So if America's like an elephant and moves very, very slowly internationally in terms of policy, they have a lot invested. They have a lot of invested militarily with nuclear deterrence, and unraveling this and deconstructing that would never happen with any single presidential term. I don't believe so. Save some all-out nuclear conflict in the world, that isn't going to change much. It could change over time, but that's not what you're voting for. That's not what I see I'm voting for. There's a lot of rhetoric sometimes around foreign policy. Post 9/11, actually, that would be a major foreign policy event because America's felt the need to go to war in Iraq as a result of 9/11 because it was sold that way. So that's one example where foreign policy became a central issue, perhaps, and people came out to vote against George Bush in 2004 for John Kerry because they opposed the war. So that's one example where a foreign policy issue, there seemed to be a difference. I thought that difference was there in 2008 when Barack Obama came on the scene. He promised, my first day in office, the first thing I'll do is I'm going to bring all those troops home. And that didn't happen. Instead, the war expanded under Obama, and that proves the point that there is little to no difference between Democrats and Republicans when it comes to what the United States is doing in the world.